So somehow Chelsea end up winning the longest game ever. This is my review, my reaction, my breakdown of Chelsea 4, Benfica 1 in the last 16 of the FIFA Club World Cup. Chelsea progress in dramatic, at times very frustrating and bizarre circumstances in Charlotte. But we are there, we have progress, which is obviously the biggest positive. I was sort of thinking this morning about this game and how long it ended up being. I think it was about 4 or 5 hours, which is longer than Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece 2001 A Space Odyssey, which takes us from literally the birth of mankind to the discovery of a new species. Here in this game, we had the dawn of a new Maresca system, ending with the rebirth of Christopher Nkunku, and also the appearance of Anselmino. So I guess a similar trajectory in both of those narratives. This was a bizarre game, but I think the frustration for me is that in normal circumstances, 9 out of 10 times, this game ends 1-0 Chelsea, maybe 2-0 Chelsea. And it's a really decent performance. I think undeniably the best of the Club World Cup from Chelsea so far. I think there's some real interesting tactical things we can speak about from a structure and kind of positional point of view, and some individual performances that are really positive. The shame of it is the game gets warped into kind of a completely different one based on that weather break that takes so long, that changes the momentum. We have an absolutely farcical refereeing decision that also gets Benfica back into a game they weren't really ever in. But I've got to give credit to the players for dealing with that chaos, for dealing with that frustration, and for coming out in extra time and completely, in the end, blitzing Benfica. It reminded me, there were slight shades in not just the final scoreline, but just in the way Chelsea just blitzed the game in the end of Rocklaw. You know, of Chelsea being able to just overwhelm their opponent in a pressurized situation. That's kind of what, especially with the way the players were kind of, you had these waves of blue late on, scoring goal after goal, which was great to see. So it feels like a very long time ago when that team news dropped. I mean, it really did. And I think the biggest thing about this game for me that I'm taking away kind of for the long term is this new setup, or at least what looked like kind of a variation to what Maresca does. Yes, we have played in a 3-back system before. We kind of do most games, especially in possession. But it was more so the players that didn't start. It was more so how that system worked and how I think it benefited Chelsea. It was kind of a 3-4-3, a 3-4-2-1, whatever way you want to describe it. That was really the setup. And I think the biggest thing was the positioning of Cole Palmer. Cole Palmer was effectively a left attacking midfielder, kind of inside forward, still with the freedom to move over to the right if he needs to. So effectively what you had was obviously Sanchez in goal, James, Colwill, Badiashile. Badiashile's inclusion was a surprise, but he had a good performance until he got injured. Neto, Lavia, Caicedo, Cucurella getting a lot of space down that left side. And then you kind of had Enzo Fernandez and Cole Palmer behind Liam Delap. Enzo, of course, still as a central midfielder does drop a lot deeper than Cole Palmer does, but still, you know, we know how Enzo is so instrumental in the final third. The first half, you know, Chelsea could have been 1 or 2-0 up. I really like the way Chelsea were able to get through Benfica's. There was chatter about Benfica's low block, but Chelsea were able to create opportunities pretty frequently, and I think it helps to have Lavia at the base. We know the passes he can play. Caicedo too was exceptional in this game, and Cucurella once again being one of Chelsea's most instrumental, or at least dominant, attacking players, which you still kind of wonder, you know, the positions he gets himself into and is finishing. Well, there was an amazing goal line clearance, and Trubin in the first half had, you know, a really good time of it. And you were kind of looking at him going, you know, can Chelsea put a bid in for him as our potential goalkeeper? Slightly different in the second half as the game progressed. But, you know, I thought all round, this was a game where Chelsea, I think, looked a lot more at their peak than they have so far in this tournament. And I think that's a really good sign. You know, you get through the group stage, you're not at your best. Can Chelsea get their momentum and their quality of performance actually to a higher level the further they go on in this tournament, which is obviously what's required, but it is a good sign. Liam Delap, I don't think had a great game. I do think at times he was let down by just some of the service. It felt like Chelsea kind of, again, why I keep on saying pre-season, and again, you know, it can always be deemed unfair. And I'm not saying that the players aren't taking this seriously, because I think, as we saw in extra time, they're taking this very seriously. But just in a sense of just those little things at the end of the performance that just are lacking. That, the final pass, the final execution. There was a moment in the second half where Liam Delap was kind of doing what he'd done at Ipswich, where a great counter-attacking opportunity, a burst down the left, and Enzo Fernandez, who with his current form I expect to play in a better pass, completely messes it up. And of course, Delap later on in the game has a goal disallowed. But I thought the first half all the way up to, the opening goal from Chelsea, I thought was a really good performance. We had limited Benfica to very little. That's the great thing, Chelsea having a lot of possession, but then you always are concerned, are we going to get done on transition? Are we going to be sloppy? In possession, Chelsea were very tidy. The way they're able to really limit Benfica to anything in that first half. The Reece James free kick is genius. It really is. Yes, you can criticise the goalkeeping, but I think 9 times out of 10, probably most keepers, and most of the time Reece James with that right foot is trying to curl across into the box. But and to be fair, the where Reece James puts that cross, that free kick, he has to put it pinpoint accurate. He has to put that, thread the eye of the needle, basically. He literally has to put it in one position if he wants to beat the goalkeeper, because he nearly gets there. And it was sensational for Reece as the captain to score a big goal. And yeah, I just sort of sit there and, there weren't many scares from Benfica, to be fair. We had to bring on Tosin for Badiashile, who got injured. But I thought Chelsea were handling the game right, and I thought there were still counter-attacking opportunities. Chelsea could have managed a little bit better to maybe increase their lead before the end. And then we get this insane 2-hour delay. I want to speak more about, we'll get to Maresca's quotes post-game. And it's just a frustration of mine. It's not me being ignorant to the difference in weather in a different climate in a different part of the world. But as Maresca touches on later, it's kind of like just preparation. And if you're going to have these consistent delays in a major football tournament as you're trying to talk about it, and also the fears of this replicating itself at basically a same time of the year for a World Cup, I don't think, for a Club World Cup where maybe a lot of people have kind of tuned it out if their clubs aren't involved, it doesn't really bother them. If this stuff happens in 12 months at the World Cup, and this happens frequently, there's going to be a lot more issues. And you kind of think, well, just, preparing for that eventuality and understanding, is there a way we can work around this? I know weather can be insane at that time of the year. I've been in Orlando sort of June, July time, and you'll have insanely good weather, very hot, but then you'll have mass rainstorms, sometimes thunderstorms that only for half an hour or 45 minutes, but they are harsh, they are severe. You have to get into cover for them. So I understand we're not playing in West London. You don't get this in West London on a frequent basis. But yeah, we'll get to that because there's frustration, and it's the delay that goes on and on and on and on. And then you get the Gusto handball and the Di Maria penalty as Chelsea are edging their way towards full time. And the handball is just, I know under the law, under their laws, it is a penalty, or at least could be deemed a penalty. But for me, you watch that back, I don't think anyone's claiming that a penalty. In real time, it does not look like that at all. The first few replays, I was like, how are they judging that a penalty? It's not like he's blocked a shot from going in. It was a very weird incident. I don't know what Gusto, it's one of those classic things. I don't know what the player's supposed to do in that scenario to get his hand out of the way when you're naturally trying to jump. And yeah, I understand why Levi was so angered, why everyone was angered. And officiating has been a consistently bad thing in this tournament. I would argue the worst thing about this tournament by a country mile. I don't think I've seen a good officiating performance in any game, really, especially Chelsea games I've watched. I think nearly all of them, they've been bad against both sides. And yeah, it obviously cost Chelsea in a big way, and it gifts Angel Di Maria the chance to get Benfica back into the game. I don't think they really deserved it. And then we go into extra time, an already fatigued situation, bad climate. Are we going to get further delays? But very quickly, Chelsea grabbed a hold of this game, mainly helped by the red card for Prestani, which was, dreadful tackle on Levi. It's one of those where you look at it and go, a few inches higher, that maybe is a terrible injury for Levi, who's obviously having a great time of it at the moment. So Chelsea then take full control, and it's Christopher Nkunku who comes off the bench. We kept on speaking about Nkunku, like the fact that he's gaining more cameos, and it's weird how much he's played in this tournament. And he scores probably his biggest Chelsea goal. It may turn out to be his last Chelsea goal, dependent on his transfer situation. But it was a Caicedo shot saved. It was good play by Cole Palmer before that. And also good from Nkunku, because Otamendi, incredible block on the line originally, and you're thinking, how has this not gone in? But it was good by Nkunku to lift his second shot, and that of course goes in. And you see the celebrations were incredible. I mean, it was almost peak Mourinho, Maresca. You know, it very much felt like the spirit of Mourinho kind of took over Maresca there, and he's sprinting down the touchline, he's barging into Nkunku. Wonderful scenes, wonderful celebrations, and I think in some ways it's a combination of them taking it very seriously, but I also probably think the 2-hour delay, which never happens, probably never happened to a majority of these players, any of them before. We've never seen a game like this before in terms of how much delay there was, and the frustration obviously on the penalty that probably, and the climate as well, the hot climate has probably raised everyone's tensions. You've got red cards going in there as well, a bad refereeing performance, and it leads to this explosion of celebration. And then Chelsea just pick Benfica off. Neto, firstly, who's had obviously a really good tournament. Another goal for him, his third of this tournament. And then Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, of all people, scores the fourth, and that puts Chelsea through. Let's look at the Maresca quotes. These were the Maresca quotes post game, and I love them because they're forthright, they're aggressive, they're also justified. Because at times I think Maresca sometimes says things that I don't think really bears out in terms of reality, but here I think he's rightly going straight for the jugular, which is what I think fans like to see. He said, "It's a joke. It's not football. I understand the stoppage for safety, but it's probably not the right place to do such a game of football. Guys, it is not football to suspend a game for 2 hours. I'm happy, but there are things you struggle to understand." He went on to say, "I can understand for security reasons you suspend the game, but if you suspend 7-8 games, that means that probably this is not the right place to do this competition." It was about a 90-minute delay, so basically the entirety of another football game could have been played in that time. And yeah, it's true. Like, it's not that you don't understand or appreciate the safety concerns. I don't want fans and players put in harm's way. That's not the point I'm making. And I think that's not the point he's making either. It's just we've seen this happen a multitude of times, especially in this tournament already. And it's kind of concerning that no one could have figured this out. You know, those American-based, responding to this and kind of joking that we're all shocked maybe in Europe watching on. Well, if it's kind of the norm, surely FIFA could have anticipated that norm and either worked a way around it or thought, is this an unmanageable situation? If this keeps happening, particularly in places like Charlotte, we can't really host games here, major World Cup games, because this is not a sport like tennis, for instance, where they do have frequent stoppages. Whenever there's a hint of rain, you have to stop playing. There's other sports that are like that as well, used to long stoppages between play. Football is not a sport like that. It never has been, and people don't want it to be like that. So I think that's a separate conversation, but I understand and share the frustration from Enzo Maresca. But with all of that chaos, with all of that madness, I still think this was a very good performance by Chelsea. I think what's intriguing for me about that new system that the game started with, is it a hint inside forward kind of thinking here of the players that Chelsea are looking to sign. We know they are now aggressively going after Pedro from Brighton. We even hear that Chelsea would still like to get Mohamed Kudus potentially on top of that. I spoke about that in yesterday's news show. Is this a sign of Maresca tweaking his system and evolving it to include players like that? Because you could see Pedro playing off Liam Delap. You could see a Kudus, for instance, playing in that kind of inside forward role. I think that's what that system gives space for. I think Chelsea naturally create a lot of opportunities. Their stats out there in terms of Chelsea's kind of creating the most, I think, big chances in the tournament so far. This was a system that was creating a lot of opportunities. And I always kind of think, I don't really have a go at the coach if I'm seeing a team structurally and just tactically who are opening up the opposition on a number of occasions and creating high-level opportunities. Then it's on those players to finish those opportunities. And I still think there maybe is a question mark, despite his productivity, of Cucurella always seemingly being the one at the end of those opportunities. And why can't, say, another player be there who's maybe a bit more clinical? But also I kind of felt there were times when Liam Delap, either there was a cutback opportunity that was just a little bit off, or counter-attacking opportunities that could have been executed a bit better. On another day, Chelsea win this game comfortably. I think, to be honest, they dominated Benfica. I think Benfica weren't really in this game at all. And that is a credit to Chelsea, because Benfica haven't exactly had an awful tournament heading up to this game. That is not an awful football team. And I think that's credit to Chelsea, who obviously have not really reached their peak so far in this tournament. So we now face Palmeiras next week. A few other players to talk about. Levi Colwill yet to lose an aerial duel battle at this tournament. 100% against Benfica, 100% against Flamengo, and 100% in the opening game against LAFC. It speaks to the transformation and growth of Levi Colwill in the past few months as a really dominant centre-back. That is a part of his game that I felt he was struggling with earlier in last season, and maybe the season before that with Pochettino. It's great to see that he's improved that and is very much growing in stature as one of Chelsea's biggest and best players, and just defenders as well. Also want to talk about Rob Prattley pointing this out, that, Pedro Neto. Now, whether we still class this, maybe it's just a bit silly from me, whether we class this as still 24-25, but he points out, just if you look at a long-term form of Pedro Neto, now just 2 goals and assists off 20 goals and assists in his first season with the club. 48 games played too. His sustained fitness and availability is a real credit to the work of himself and also the medical staff. I mean, that's another point that, when Neto came to Chelsea, one of the major red flags about that transfer from Wolves was this is a guy who breaks down very frequently. Touchwood, hasn't broken down at all. He may have missed a couple of games, but I don't think he's come anywhere close to what he was like at Wolves. And that is credit for a club that has had a lot of injury problems, for a club that has for quite a few years now suffered with players going down consistently. So it's nice to see that at least in the long term, maybe we are now starting to see that flip back round where Chelsea are able to maintain their best players and keep them fit for longer periods of time. Reece James is probably the prime example of that, given his extreme situation. Looking forward to Palmeiras, obviously. Esteval William will be obviously the big narrative talking point, and it's quite weird because I think he officially kind of becomes a Chelsea player on the 1st of July, but I still think because of the rules of this tournament, he stays with Palmeiras. And if you look at kind of the potential of Chelsea missing players for the semi-final, it is quite concerning. Liam Delap, Pedro Neto, Palmer, Cucurella, Colwill, Tosin and Reece, all now 1 yellow card away from missing a potential semi-final, which I think, based on our side of the draw, is likely, unless there's any shocks, could be Man City, which is problematic. Caicedo is obviously suspended for the next game, another high-intensity game against a South American side. We saw the problems we faced when we came up against Flamengo. Not having Caicedo is obviously a massive, massive blow. I wonder if we see Dario Asugo, just based on the way Maresca has profiled kind of deeper midfielders in his system. Lavia, I think this is the most Lavia's played for Chelsea in one game, and hopefully he'll be ready to go again. At the very least, there is a gap. There's a nice gap between the 2 games now. But Caicedo obviously missing is a big thing. Nicholas Jackson is also back. So at least from an attacking point of view, we have him to potentially rotate with Liam Delap. But that is it. I mean, insane game, one of the maddest games of football, the longest games of football, especially from a Chelsea point of view, you're ever likely to watch. And I think it's credit to the team that they responded to the pressure, they responded to the adversity, and you could see how much it meant to them, and maybe reaching that peak, fitness and peak form as we hit the latter stages of the tournament. And I think from Maresca tactically, I think there's some really interesting things that we can dive into there in terms of the 3-4-3, how it worked in that first half, especially against a team who were forced to sit back, not have a lot of the ball, but then also being able to create good looks at goal. I think that is obviously something Chelsea have struggled against. You've got to factor in, this is a Champions League level team. This is not Esperance. This is not LAFC. This is not a Conference League team. Benfica are not a bad team, and we can caveat it all up we want, but I think that was a really good sign of the way Chelsea looked so dominant, but not just passive possession. It was possession that was actually leading to opportunities, which is something I've been critical of before, but I think in this circumstance it looks very positive, and what new additions could play into this. So I'm going to be doing a podcast today about Jamie Gittins. Obviously that news broke at like the worst time, literally an hour before kickoff, so I couldn't make a show about it. But we'll talk about Jamie Gittins. We'll talk about the rest of the news coming up surrounding Stamford Bridge, and obviously building up to Palmeiras next week in a massive game for Chelsea in the Club World Cup quarter-final. So thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again very, very soon. All the best.